from UT Austin. He co-authored with Matt Chesser, Galvanic, Beyond the Reef, Tarawa and the Gilberts, November 1943 for NHHC. He has also published Violence in Hill Country, the Texas Frontier and the Civil War, as well as several articles on Texas history. Our third presenter, Christopher B Habern Sr., serves as a historian on the Fleet History Team at Naval History and Heritage Command. He earned a BA with honors in history from Penn State University and a Master of Arts in History from the University of Maryland at College Park. Mr. Habern is the author of Ensuring the Lifeline to Victory, Anti-Submarine Warfare Convoys and Allied Cooperation in European Waters During World War I. Take a breath. And a chapter.
That wasn't my idea.
He also wrote a chapter in the U.S. Marine Corps History Division's Investigating EWO, the flag raisings in Myth, Memory, and Esprit de Corps. He has written over 100 entries for the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships. Prior to joining the NHHC, he was a historian with the U.S. Coast Guard Historian's Office for 18 years. Mr. Habern is also a veteran, having served as an infantry officer in the United States Army. Annette Ammerman, who will be doing our commentary, joined the then Marine Corps Historical Center in 1995 as an intern and returned in 1996 for a year and a half as a research assistant. She returned to the Marine Corps Historical Program in 2003 as a reference historian and managed the Marine Corps Lineage and Honors programs, assisting thousands of patrons each year. I know I did it numerous times. Eventually, she became the head of the reference branch. In 2020, she joined the DoD POW MIA Accounting Agency as a historian in the Research Support Division. She holds degrees from Shenandoah University, George Mason University, and the University of Birmingham in Great Britain. She is a recipient of the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation's Simons Shaw Public History Award and the Department of the Navy Civilian Service Commendation Medal. She's published numerous articles on Marine Corps history and served as the series historian and general editor of the Marine Corps World War I commemorative publications and is the author of 2 works: The United States Marine Corps and the First World War, Anthology, Selected Bibliography, and Annotated Order of Battle, and The Marines Have Landed, 80 Years of Marine Corps Landings, 1935 to 2015. She's currently working on a book entitled Every Climb and Place, Marines and the Polar Expeditions, 1838 to 1956. Without further ado, turn it over to Guy to present his paper. We got your presentation up.
If you could just go to the second slide, please, and we'll start there. Thank you. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, overall commander of the Tarawa Invasion Force, had planned a massive naval and air bombardment of Japanese defenses to soften them up with a follow-up amphibious assault by the 2nd Marine Division. Believing the destruction of the Japanese garrison on Batio Island would require only a single day, confidence in achieving a quick victory ran high, especially among Navy officers. We will not neutralize, we will not destroy. We will obliterate the defenses on Batio, promised Rear Admiral Howard F. Kingman, the Naval Bombardment Force Commander for Tarawa. Despite the 3,400 American casualties over the 3-day Battle of Tarawa, 23 November 1943, the lessons learned from the after-action analyses was tremendous. Slide 3. In the succeeding decades, secondary literature about the battle claimed little understood tide conditions and an ineffective naval fire support led to the horrific loss of life, completely ignoring the formidable enemy fortifications. In addition, while many still maintain Tarawa was the sole reason for creation of the underwater demolition teams, a closer examination of such an iconic and innovative unit is instead a story of steady naval adaptation leading to the creation of a special unit that helped win the war. Next slide. Admiral Turner himself contributed to the belief that the invasion was a costly blunder, later swearing the Navy would never again make the same mistakes that led to terrible Tarawa. However, Turner was not present at the landings on D-Day, and later admitted his worst performance occurred not at Tarawa, but the simultaneous assault on Macon Island. The poor choice of the landing site for the amphibious assault there resulted in a nightmare of getting supplies ashore caused by the narrowness of Macon's beaches. Turner's staff fatally reasoned that LCVPs could easily reach the beach at any time. The collective mistakes made at Macon led Admiral Turner to admit, in retrospect, that's why I pushed for the development of the underwater demolition team so hard. However, next slide. However, several historians examining Tarawa believe the planning and overall conduct of the battle was sound. One of the first was Marine Corps Colonel Ralph Robinson, an instructor at the Naval Academy's Department of Intelligence. In early May 1946, he addressed a group of Naval War College students about amphibious operations in the Gilbert Islands in 1943. Colonel Robinson concluded the use of power tactics rather than surprise vindicated amphibious doctrine and felt the most important deficiency had been the use of naval gunfire. Colonel Robinson did not think the high cost of the operation was the result of faulty organization, command failure, or tactical inadequacy. Furthermore, he stressed that the high casualties at Tarawa resulted from the bitterest opposition encountered from the Japanese up to that time in the Pacific. While the experiences in the Gilbert Islands prompted Turner to call for the development of underwater combat demolition units, the seeds for creating such a specialized combat force had already begun to take shape in Washington. 6 months prior to Tarawa, on 6 May 1943, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, Chief of Naval Operations, directed the Naval Demolition Project to make provisions to meet the present and urgent requirement. The present and urgent requirement was an unrealized plan for a highly trained group of individuals who could swim in the enemy-held waters to find and dismantle or destroy any obstacles that could do harm to American seaborne invasion forces that might prevent amphibious landings. At the outset of the war, such a unit in the U.S. Navy did not exist. Realizing that future amphibious landings of enemy-held islands could also not proceed without comprehensive reconnaissance, Navy leadership began experimenting with highly trained units created for such a purpose. Tarawa proved that naval bombardment alone would not eliminate enemy obstacles impeding amphibious operations. Therefore, the creation of an elite U.S. Navy force to deal exclusively with beach reconnaissance and the elimination of underwater obstacles began taking shape. The resulting UDTs trained extensively for clearing enemy obstacles and creating channels for invasion forces to come ashore. Drawing upon the training and experiences of other maritime units predating them, the UDTs proved to be a highly motivated, creative, and successful group of naval warriors. Before the conclusion of the war in the Pacific, the innovation UDT brought against enemy defenses became an integral part of amphibious warfare. Prior to Tarawa, Navy leaders had only marginally considered the potential of sea commandos to wreak havoc on enemy defenses before a seaborne invasion. Taking a cue from the British, at war since 1939, the potential for crack seaborne commando units seemed remarkable. The Marine Corps, getting the jump on the Navy, stood up its own special operations unit known as the Marine Raiders in January 1940. At the behest of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Ocean areas, the Raiders conducted a raid on Macon in August 1942. Although small in scale and action, Although small scale in action, the raiders were to serve as a diversionary force, drawing attention from the Solomon Islands. With mixed results, the raider assault presented a morale boost to Americans at home. The USMC historian Major John T. Hoffman claimed the threats to raids on rear area installations inadvertently played a, quote, part in the subsequent Japanese decision, unquote, to heavily fortify places like Tarawa. Prior to the war, no one had experimented with the demolition of massed obstacles in amphibious assault. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, tasked with developing doctrine to destroying beach obstacles in the interwar period, began taking the lead by the end of 1942. The Army, therefore, had a few months lead on experimenting with beach demolition prior to Admiral King's directive, and King hurriedly ordered work and training towards permanent naval demolition units for assignment to other amphibious forces in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The first phase of this plan included a letter to the Chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks directing dispatch of 8 officers and 30 enlisted men for duty with Operational Demolition Unit and Naval Demolition Unit No. 1, established at Amphibious Training Base, Solomons, Maryland. These 38 men all reported from the Construction Battalion, or CB, better known as the CBs, training camp at Camp Peary, Williamsburg, Virginia, transferring to ATB Solomons only 8 days after King's directive. A determined and scholarly-looking naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Draper L. Kaufman, played a large role in shaping highly trained, innovative units of naval commandos with the Naval Combat Demolition Units, NCDUs, and UDTs. A phenomenal organizer, Kaufman received a promotion to commander and orders from Admiral King to begin the Navy's bomb disposal school at the Washington Navy Yard in January 1942. In June 1943, King issued further orders to the experienced bomb disposal expert, directing Kaufman to organize the first Navy demolition teams. Scouting a place to train, Kaufman decided to move his experimental group to the site at the amphibious base at Fort Pierce, Florida, where Army demolition units were already trained. With steely determination and an innate ability to get things done quickly and effectively, Kaufman and his small staff established the Naval Combat Demolition Unit School at Fort Pierce on 6 June 1943. The goal was to create naval combat demolition units trained in the removal or demolition of any hazards posing a threat to amphibious forces assaulting a beach objective. Realizing he needed students to begin training in combat demolition, Commander Kaufman began recruiting officers from the CVs and the bomb disposal school at the Washington Navy Yard. The enlisted men were drawn from CV trainees at Camp Peary, and they were only informed they would be volunteering for hazardous duty. To build the successful amphibious force he envisioned, Kaufman recognized he needed to select recruits who were intelligent, had the ability to think quickly on their feet, were in extremely good physical shape, and had no fear of handling demolition. In reality, Kaufman, quote, did not have a clue how many men he would eventually need. However, casting such a wide net for those types of individuals early in the war also forced him to temporarily search outside of the Navy as well. According to Lieutenant Junior Grade Francis Kane, one of the first volunteers trained in naval combat demolition, quote, Kaufman gathered 500 men from the CB units, a couple of British commandos, and several U.S. Army Rangers. Next slide. Commander Kaufman also contributed the rigorous training program first instituted at Fort Pierce, negotiating with the Joint Army, Navy, Scouts and Raiders, SNR, also training at Fort Pierce. He asked the instructors to condense their 8-week physical training course into 1 week for his trainees. The completely volunteer program, designed to weed out anybody not tough enough with tremendous endurance, resulted in a 40% dropout rate after the first Hell Week. Kaufman himself successfully passed the grueling training phase, alongside men nearly 15 years younger than himself. The purpose of Hell Week had the additional benefit of building an enormous esprit de corps among the survivors. Despite accomplishing a great deal with originating naval combat demolition, Kaufman was not directly responsible for the formation of UDTs. According to former Navy SEAL officer and author Tom Hawkins, UDTs were formed in December 1943, while Kaufman was still at Fort Pierce. He did, however, leave his training position in April 1944 to become commanding officer of UDT 5. Next slide. A graduate with the first group of naval demolition volunteers, Lieutenant Kane has argued that the term UDT did not come into use until about halfway through World War II. Kaufman called us Naval Combat Demolition Unit. Kane states that the UDTs were not intended for deployment in the Pacific Theater. Quote, many people seem to have the idea that the original area of operation for UDT was in the South Pacific. Not so. In the beginning, everything was geared toward France. However, according to the U.S. Atlantic Fleet's A History of the Amphibious Training Command, the name UDT teams was chosen to avoid confusion with NCDUs. Prior joint service units preceding UDT also played a significant role in their development, training, and subsequent operations. As Lieutenant Kane recalled, there were in fact several groups existing prior to the UDT program that both informed and inspired naval underwater demolitions. Many had a maritime connection, but were not strictly Navy groups. Besides the aforementioned Marine Raiders and NCDUs, these included Scouts and Raiders, Special Services Unit 1, and the Office of Strategic Services Maritime Unit, the OSSMU. Composed of sailors from the boat pool at ATB Solomons and soldiers from the U.S. Army's 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions, the SNR unit was directly the result of the Army's pre-war concepts of beach reconnaissance and demolition. SNR teams received training at ATB Little Creek, Virginia, prospected landing beaches, and leading assault forces to landing zones in complete darkness. Training for the SNR moved to Fort Pierce in January 1943, and the Joint Service Amphibious Scout and Raider School taught raiders to gather intelligence behind enemy lines without revealing their presence. Next. In February 1943, Rear Admiral Henry Hewitt, commander, Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet, sent a memorandum to the commanding general of the Army Ground Forces requesting a specially organized company of engineers. Requesting the unit be available by 1 March 1943, he also directed, quote, the training of scouts and raiders and the technique of investigating and destroying beach and underwater obstacles, unquote. That Hewitt directed his request to the Army and not the Navy is significant but not fully understood. While his colleagues, Admirals Turner and King, discovered rather early on in the war the need for underwater demolition combat force, Admiral Hewitt eventually came around to their way of thinking, also believing the Navy should take the lead in the creation of a specialized force for amphibians. Next slide. After the successful operations at Normandy and southern France in mid-1944, the Navy finally emerged from out of the Army's shadow, leading the way in underwater demolition. The Navy did this by demonstrating a great ability to adapt to ever-changing wartime conditions and incorporating training and personnel from the varied maritime groups into the unit. With Allied armies firmly secure in Europe, Navy personnel attached to the NCDUs transferred to the Pacific to join the expanding UDT program. The result of NCDU men incorporating into the UDTs provided for a seasoned corps of veterans with the knowledge and can-do attitude to perform harrowing demolition work under enemy fire. However, the differences between the various maritime units were more than just a matter of military branch and geography. Tactics, training, and gear used in operations were just some of the minor differences and should not suggest a specific linear evolution of naval commandos. In the opinion of historian James Odell, naval combat demolition units did not evolve from the Scouts and Raiders, nor did the underwater demolition teams evolve from the naval combat demolition units. Each had a separate origin at different locations. Next slide. From that first training class at Fort Pierce, 11 NCDU units graduated and went overseas. 3 teams deployed to Amphibious Forces Pacific, joining Admiral Turner in Hawaii. Admiral Turner further recommended the reorganization of these 6-man naval combat demolition units into UDTs. The new teams will thus have a strength of 100 officers and men with a headquarters unit and 4 platoons. Signing off on Turner's recommendation, Admiral Nimitz obtained Navy Department approval and further ordered the establishment of training and underwater experimentation school in Hawaii. In late January 1944, during the invasion of Kwajalein, UDTs were still a joint service unit composed of Army, Marines, and Navy personnel. Impressed by reports of the success of joint service UDT operations at Kwajalein, Admiral King maneuvered to make future amphibious operations with UDT an all-Navy endeavor, believing unit cohesion would become stronger if all volunteers came from the same branch of service, specifically the Navy. Next slide. King also cited a statement from an after-action report titled "Experience in the Marshes," which hinted at the difficulty in, quote, maintaining discipline among soldiers, sailors, and Marines who served together in the same unit, unquote, as further evidence to support this theory. Ultimately, King's desire to make UDT an all-Navy organization came to fruition. After the operations in the Marshes, UDT 1 and 2 disbanded, with their Army and Marine Corps members returned to parent units. By the end of 1944, with 13 UDTs in training at the same time, Admiral King finally received the all-Navy Special Operations Force he had requested. Next slide. With the teams finally under full Navy control, the UDTs added or refined tactics and procedures after gaining experience from pre-assault landing, making notes of lessons learned. The continual adaptation paid off at amphibious landings such as at Leyte, Lingayen Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Borneo, where the UDTs demonstrated their value repeatedly. Upon Japan's surrender in August 1945, the first naval personnel to go ashore on Japan on 28 August were members of UDT 21. The Frogmen also conducted a search for mines at the entrance to Tokyo Bay, where Allied ships hosted the formal Imperial Japanese surrender ceremony on 2 September. A reporter for CB magazine best described the Navy's success with the underwater demolition teams formed in World War II. Quote, demolition teams weren't fostered in any one place, weren't formed because of any one action, weren't dreamed up by any one man, unquote. While not solely responsible for the formation of the UDTs, forward-thinking Navy leaders such as Admirals Turner, King, and Kaufman nonetheless played pivotal roles in their creation. Next slide. Implementation of the rigorous training requirements of UDT personnel, drawn directly from previous maritime units with reconnaissance and combat experience, set precedents that still influence the training and work of current Navy SEALs to this day. By adapting the battle experiences and innovations of these predecessor groups, the UDTs undoubtedly perfected them in the process of the island hopping campaign of the Pacific Theater. The finest traditions of the U.S. Navy, UDTs created a lasting legacy of amphibious innovation during the war, exemplifying the ability of the Navy to adapt and inspire future amphibious and special warfare doctrine. Thank you.
All right, this is a summary of Dr. Rowland's paper, Innovations in Naval Gunfire Support in the Pacific War. The main point in Dr. Rowland's paper is that, and some of these are obvious to us all, the U.S. carried out an unprecedented amphibious campaign across the Pacific in World War II. To be effective, a necessity for an effective naval gunfire support was required. Amphibious operations required innovation in both the USN and the USNC. Historians have identified factors helping to determine innovative potential as strategic calculations, technology, organizational politics, and a services culture. There was also foresight and organization. The fact that folks recognize this very on, people like Pete Ellis, pretty important. Technological improvements in the interwar period, especially the development of better radio communications in aircraft, also had a role. Therefore, the USN and the USMC appear to have in place most of the preconditions to create an effective naval gunfire support system. Despite this, naval gunfire support remained underdeveloped on the eve of Pearl Harbor. Early campaigns did not lead to significant changes to pre-war approaches. The events at Tarawa, the stern teacher of combat, resulted in changes, and the service was receptive due to, quote, the Navy's culture of innovation, unquote. Numerous changes to naval gunfire support training techniques and improved technology, quote Dr. Rowland, all subject to iterative refinement by a system of feedback loops with its origins in the pre-war Navy culture. The result is this organizational capacity for learning and innovation would manifest itself in the development of a system of effective naval gunfire support that played an important role in winning the Pacific War. As to the pre-war approach again, early recognition, especially in the United States Marine Corps, Ellis publishes his well-known work in 1921, and that the Pacific War would require extensive amphibious assaults, and that naval gunfire support would need to be considered by planning staffs. By 1926, the Navy formally assigns the mission of amphibious assault to the Marine Corps. During the 1920s, fleet exercises exposed some of the shortcomings of various methods, but efforts really began accelerating in 1933 with the formation of the Fleet Marine Force, and with Quantico developing doctrine, which results in the 1934 tentative manual for landing operations, and then the later publication within the Navy, Fleet Training Publication 167 in 1938, or FTP 167, which is the doctrinal basis for amphibious operations. But there were still many pre-war issues with naval gunfire support. There were many challenges. What is the goal of this gunfire? Is it neutralization or destruction of targets? There was also the limits of naval artillery, which is primarily designed for a fleet action, which is the Navy's main concern, on being used for naval gunfire support. What is the ammunition load that needs to be carried among ships who will be doing this? Do you need high explosive or do you need a lot of armor-piercing ammunition? There's also issues of accuracy at speed by large Navy ships, battleships, and cruisers shooting at fixed targets. The Navy was also planning for short bombardments due to potential attacks by Imperial Japanese Navy surface, subsurface, or aerial threats. But FTP 167 was an example of the Navy's interwar system of learning. You use feedback loops between the planners and OpNav, the wargaming that goes on at the Naval War College, and the fleet exercises and what is learned from that. However, the exercises, for several reasons, did not accurately predict wartime conditions. The training conditions were unrealistic, there was a lack of funds, and naval gunfire support spotting teams within the Navy were ad hoc. This mission was essentially considered an additional duty and did not receive much notice. What happens in wartime? The early campaigns in the Pacific and North Africa resulted in what's known as Change 3 to FTP 167, which provided more explicit guidance about who has responsibilities in roles and missions. There was also a recognition of the need for improved training, and ranges were set up in Maryland and in the territory of Hawaii, where you essentially had islands which were set aside for doing nothing but practicing bombardment. The Navy and the Marine Corps was still working with ad hoc formations, however, for naval gunfire support fire control parties. The Army, however, had started developing dedicated organizations in September 1942 that leads to the establishment of Joint Assault Signal Company, which is shortened later to, which is known as JASCO, later shortened to ASCO. However, as planning starts for the Gilbert's campaign, the Pacific experiences have not provided American staffs with an adequate understanding of the level of coordination and techniques required to achieve synchronized, effective fires during contested landing operations. Tarawa, unlike earlier targets, was heavily fortified and for the size of the position, well manned. The action at Tarawa, naval gunfire support was based largely on earlier doctrine with some improvements. Again, short shore bombardment due to a fear of a potential naval attack by the Japanese. And, again, how are you going to deal with this if you suddenly have to pull away ships to involve in a naval action? Also, how do you deal with different types of threats, such as the aerial threat or subsurface threat? Naval gunfire support at Tarawa initially had some positive effect. The first three waves that get ashore at Tarawa have relatively limited difficulty, but then it gets much, much worse. It results in a bloody 3-day battle. Numerous lessons were learned from the action at Tarawa. First, longer bombardments, both naval gunfire support and aerial bombardments, were needed. There was a need to destroy hardened targets. This meant more AP ammunition and less high explosives. The mapping and designation system for naval gunfire support was described as, quote, cumbersome and inadequate. Fire support plans needed to be condition-based, not a phased timetable. They had to be able to respond to people on the ground. There was a recognition for a need for improved aerial spotting, and something I found, fascinating in this paper, the recognition of the need for waterproof radios, which had not previously been realized. There was also a need for specialized amphibious command ships, which Chris's paper will talk to. There also was a push for more training, specifically at the range in Hawaii, not only for ASCOs, but for pilots and ship crews as well. The results of this was rapid improvements. And when I say rapid, even by the time you get to the landing at Kwajalein in January of 1944, you see improvements. It's not complete, but it is certainly a major step forward. There is the first fleet-specific revision of FTP 167 issued in 1 May of 44. In other words, the guys that are out on the front line and how are they dealing with it. The Navy, again, engaged in an iterative learning process until the end of the war, resulting in constant innovation in the training, doctrine, and implementation of naval gunfire support. Operations greatly improved until the end of the war. More sophisticated planning for naval gunfire support, shifting of authority for execution of the bombardment to a lower echelon. Instead of being with the guy who's overseeing the whole landing, it is reduced down to a lower level echelon who has the responsibility for naval gunfire support. The development of specialized radio boats that operated on the flanks of landings to coordinate naval gunfire support and coordinate air support, as well as other developments. These improvements meant that the Japanese could not effectively stall or stop the most critical phase of an amphibious assault, the movement from ship to shore and the seizure of initial objectives. The conclusion, I'm actually going to read the last paragraph from Dr. Rowland's paper. The interwar Navy's culture of innovation and a system of feedback loops promoted rapid learning in wartime. At the conclusion of each operations, lessons were gathered, disseminated, and incorporated into a system that supported continuous improvement in training, planning, tactics, and techniques. This meant that the application of naval gunfire shifted radically from 1943 to 1945 in the Pacific, with clear results initially realized only 2 months after the Tarawa operation. In the amphibious assault phase, naval gunfire support doctrine transitioned from one of brief, long-range neutralization fire without effective synchronization with other elements of the operation to one that emphasized multi-day, close firing for destruction in synchronization with aerial bombardment and also coordinated with the advancement of ground troops, all aided by air spotters and ASCO personnel. Once ashore, new called fire techniques allowed for support for American troops that was virtually unimaginable just a few years prior. Innovation in naval gunfire support techniques did not win the Pacific War, but it minimized the American casualties and proved to be a key factor in dozens of successful amphibious assaults on the long road to victory. Thank you very much.
Well done, Curtis. Cameras checking.
Okay.
This is the next slide. Just put up the first slide, and I think we'll just go to slide 3 because that's an older version of the presentation. Check just to make sure. Okay, good to know. Good to know.
He's watching.
Always.
Always watching.
Okay, next slide, and then go on to the third slide. That one, thank you. This paper's title was prompted by this image. The chalk text on the bulkhead marked by the red arrow reads, quote, "Again, we have been asked to do the impossible. Let's do it as usual." Next slide. When he became Commandant, General David H. Berger proclaimed, "The Marine Corps will be trained and equipped as a naval expeditionary force in readiness and reoriented Marines toward great power competition in the Indo-Pacific." Pledging to return the Corps to its Fleet Marine Forces roots, his design and its geographic locus evoked World War II and prompted me to consider what innovations enabled those successful landings, especially as Isley and Crowell noted, quote, "The chief shortcomings were not in doctrine, but rather in the means to put existing doctrine into effect," unquote. Next slide. Regarding those means, much has been written about the vessels and craft developed to carry men and material to the beaches and world. Next slide. I would suggest that there is one important ship type that has been overlooked, the Amphibious Force Command Ship, or AGC. After all, these ships became the essential network-centric, integrative hubs for effective command and control of complex, multifaceted amphibious operations from 1943 through the war's end. This paper will address that process. Next slide. As Dr. Rowland has already addressed much of the development of amphibious doctrine, I'll just highlight just a few things. Despite its title, the Tentative Landing Operations Manual, which was promulgated by CNO William H. Stanley on 1 August 1934, became the fundamental basis for U.S. amphibious doctrine. As Dr. Rowland mentioned, that document was subsequently modified into Fleet Training Publication 167 in 1938. 3 years later, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall issued Landing Operations on Hostile Shores, Field Manual 31-5. This was an exact duplication of FTP 167. The only thing changed was the covers. So this is further reinforcement and evidence of the fact that basically the tentative landing manual as established in 1934 was to become the joint amphibious doctrine for the United States. Next slide. Given their naval character, the landings were to be commanded by a Navy flag officer. Task force organization consisted of two main components, the landing force and the naval support groups, including the fire support group, air group, the covering group, and the transport group. Each component's responsibilities during all phases were enumerated and parallelism of command was defined. The doctrine also established procedures for communications between echelons ashore and afloat and the landing forces, service, and supply. The foremost challenge would be the ship-to-shore movement. More than just a ferrying operation, the over-the-water movement would follow patterns of traditional fire maneuver on land, but complicated fire support. Securing the beachhead required the landing force to survive the gap between the employment of seaborne fire support and its own artillery ashore. Given this theoretical construct, the next step was practical proof of concept. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, flexes were components of annual fleet exercises between 1935 and 1941. There were limits to realism based on financial and safety constraints. The last of these exercises was conducted at New River, North Carolina in the summer of 1941. The largest attempted, it landed a two-division sized force that included regiments of the Army's 1st Infantry Division. While the flexes served as proof of concept, early Allied amphibious operations showed that much was still to be done. An Army officer in 1943 noted, quote, "We accepted FTP 167 as our doctrine at the outset. That document still stands, although we found some things which did not seem to work so well." That's an understatement. Simply put, the existing means for effecting C2 were inadequate. Next slide. Any examination of Allied amphibious operations must begin with the British. After Gallipoli, there was little interest in amphibious or combined operations. Little Hart even went so far as to write, quote, "A landing on a foreign coast in the face of hostile troops has become impossible." Even so, the British established the Inter-Service Training and Development Center in May 1938 to develop materiel and methods, conduct training for the, quote, "seizure of defended beaches." After Dunkirk, the British realized that winning the war required landing in Europe and created the Combined Operations Headquarters, or COHQ, on 17 July. Their first combined operation against Vichy-held Car, however, was a debacle. They embarked both the naval and landing force commanders and their staffs on the cruiser Devonshire. She, however, was poorly configured and equipped to effect C2. Worse, Major General Noel Irwin was separated from his troops. After having changed shifts multiple times due to naval needs, Irwin lamented, quote, "Seldom have I felt so impotent as during this expedition when I was separated from my forces and tied to any naval operations which might become necessary." In his mind, commanders must be kept separate from naval operations. What was required was a combined headquarters ship. The British began to meet this need with Churchill's appointment of Louis Mountbatten. He redefined COHQ as an inter-service organization in order to prepare for invasion of France. Introducing modern methods and organization, he appointed a chief of staff and created a signals department. While the British did successfully land at Diego Suarez in May 1942, the next combined operation proved another disaster. Still without a headquarters ship for the raid against Dieppe on 19 August 1942, Mountbatten employed 3 Hunt-class destroyers in the hopes of ensuring communications issues on one of the destroyers and the loss of another helped doom the operation. Dieppe seemingly proved 2 things: British ineptitude and that Bell Hart was correct. Next slide. Expediency demanded converting an existing hull. With the shipping shortage, Mountbatten only procured the twin screw Lolo on 25 March 1942. Built as a passenger liner, the COHQ signal staff judged her to be well suited, as she had a roomy interior and did not present a large target. The communication system was the most important feature, requiring the capacity for separate channels between the ship and troops en route ashore, the landing craft, the accompanying aircraft carriers, the aircraft providing CAP and CAS, and the covering force bombardment liaison. The reconfigured layout comprised a central room with 19 transmitters and 26 receivers. Each service had their own spaces with operations rooms and separate spaces for subsidiary working units, along with separate intelligence centers and cipher offices with an action coding desk equipped with typewriters, duplicating machines, teleprinters, and pneumatic tubes. Data would be correlated and displayed in a joint operations room. There were also special monitoring facilities for enemy radar and radio transmissions and a weather section. The converted command citadel was under protective cover on the lowest deck level, manned round the clock at synchronized information for a combined perspective. Planning and administrative offices were above, with the operations room and auxiliary offices close to the bridge. Equipment monitored enemy radio transmissions to include radio-controlled weapons. Lastly, the joint operations room was located forward with a large display table and 3 wall state boards with situational and weather updates. A special desk was provided for the senior bombardment liaison and the fighter direction officer. And all spaces as below were linked by interconnecting doors, intercom, and pneumatic tubes. Bulolo could function as a corps headquarters, division headquarters, or both, and plan future operations all simultaneously. Designated a landing ship headquarters, or LSH, Bulolo was later joined by 2 additional converted merchant vessels and 3 captain-class frigates. Mountbatten pressed the U.S. Navy to build this type and provided detailed plans and staffing requirements. Rear Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, mentioned earlier by Guy, commander of Amphibious Forces U.S. Atlantic Fleet, visited the ship during trials in 1942 and seconded Mountbatten's fleet. Next slide. Early U.S. landings replicated those of the British. The first was a hastily organized counterattack to seize Tulagi, Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner's Amphibious Task Force landed the 1st Marine Division. Turner exercised command from the transport Macaulay. Deemed adequate by 1942 standards, she was not. Staff accommodations were insufficient and her communications were worse. With 2 transmitters and 5 receivers of limited range, there were also a minimal number of networks. Interference was commonplace, and flawed radio procedures ensured that supporting aircraft had no direct contact with the shore. Just as the Guadalcanal campaign reached its zenith in November 1942, the Allies landed in Vichy-held North Africa. The U.S.-led Western Task Force landed in Morocco, while the British-led Center and Eastern Task Forces landed in Algeria. Like Dakar, both commanders, Rear Admiral Hewitt and Major General George Patton, were embarked on the heavy cruiser Augusta, which was thought to have sufficient space and fitted with additional radios. Patton, however, would not exercise command over landing forces when Augusta was forced to maneuver against Vichy warships. His after-action report noted that joint headquarters should not be on a ship that may be required in a naval engagement. The Army commander must have adequate communications independent of naval requirements to maintain contact with the troops, and Army net control stations should not be on a combatant ship as hits and the blast effect of firing guns rendered radios inoperable. Hewitt also noted that, quote, a headquarters ship with adequate communications facilities is essential to amphibious operations. This was bolstered by Bulolo's effective coordination of Gunfire and CAS for the Algiers line. A year later, in November 1943, the Navy assaulted the Tara and Macon atolls. As Dr. Rowland has already discussed this at length, I will just simply discuss the matters of the command ship, which was designated the Battleship Maryland, okay, which was flagship for Rear Admiral Henry W. Hill's Southern Attack. While additional radios were mounted, the comm center was on a flag bridge wing level with the elevated 16-inch gun muzzles. And as Patton observed, the pre-landing bombardment, shut down radios and their networks. Also, the radios wedged into the comm center generated interference that further hobbled nets. Hill did not contact the supporting carriers and was forced to use TVS to adjust the fire plan. He also reduced the number of channels for ship-to-shore communications. Given these problems, it's no wonder that the situation on Red Beach at 0959 on D-Day was determined to be issued in doubt. This would be the last major U.S. amphibious operation undertaken without an AGC. As Morrison noted, the network of communications in modern amphibious warfare had become so vast and complicated, and the officers and men necessary to staff amphibious force headquarters so numerous that no ordinary combatant or auxiliary ship could hold them. End quote. Next slide. Like the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy would modify existing hulls. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, Assistant Chief of Staff for Readiness, requested 3 ships for conversion as early as 28 July 1942, 10 days before the Guadalcanal landing. The designator AGC was based on General Auxiliary AG and Subclass C, meaning Command, Control, or Communications. Despite this, they were always called Amphibious Force flagships. 15 single-screw C-2 Maritime Commission ships were tagged for AGC duty. Of 2 similar types, all were 459 feet long and displaced about 12,800 tons. Their better lines and improved propulsion machinery generated 15.5 knots, making them attractive to the Navy as auxiliary. They were built around 3 main spaces: a joint operations room that maintained the air and surface picture, a command room for all the service's senior officers, and a flag plot. To gain the necessary internal space, the hull was built up 1 deck between the 2 goalpost masts. Each ship had a combat information center capable of fighter control and a voice filter room that evaluated and forwarded information. Other input passed through an intelligence office, and there was also a photo interpretation room. Each service had designated office spaces, and print shops produced maps and other operationally required documents. Mounting the most extensive radio communications afloat, these ships were akin to fleet carriers. Initially fitted with long-range SK air search radar on a lattice mainmast, the ships also had air navigation beacons. By the war's end, most had TDY jammers. There were antenna interference problems, however, that required relocating outriggers fore and aft of the radar tower to clear the SK air search set. More generally, the radio transmitters in very close proximity interfered with each other, and with so many radio transmitters taking up space, in November 1944, they were moved to clear space for the flag bridge. Around the same time, poorly ventilated CICs and photo interpretation rooms were ordered air-conditioned to offset tropical heat. Each ship also had craft to carry commanders ashore and mounted 2 5-inch guns plus an anti-aircraft battery of 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter guns. To meet the immediate need for AGCs while the C-2s were converted, the attack transport Ancon was converted at the Norfolk Navy Yard and redesignated AGC-4. She became the flagship for Commander Amphibious Forces Atlantic. Also converted was the seaplane tender Biscayne, modified at Mers El Kabir, Algeria in May 1943. She was the only AGC converted outside a U.S. yard. The 6 surviving 327-foot Treasury class Coast Guard cutters built between 1935 and 1937 as potential naval auxiliary were also converted. Next slide. After North Africa, the British were concerned about the U.S. command ships for the July 1943 system. They though initially considered ill-suited, Biscayne performed well as Joss Force flagship and later reprised that role at Salerno, Anzio, and southern France, as well as in the Pacific. Ancon's AGC combat debut was as Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk, Central Task Force flagship. As her CIC was deemed ill-suited for the Army Air Force tactical control, and LSD was selected to perform that function instead. Even so, Ancon mounted 56 wireless sets, and after-action reports assessed her performance as practically ideal. Ancon was later fitted with an air control center for improved flagship service for Salerno in September 1940. While early practices called for 1 flagship for an entire operation, the increasing operational complexity and availability of more command ships produced functional diversification. By June 1944, the British wanted 1 command ship for each division going ashore for Normandy. Ancon was flagship for the 11th Amphibious Force at Omaha Beach and provided instructions for forces afloat ashore, transferred Army unit headquarters ashore, and made boats available to carry men and material to the beachhead. At the same time, the AGC Catoctin was the planning headquarters for the invasion of southern France, which it led on 15. Next slide. These 2 maps illustrate the differences in scale between the 2 theaters, not just regarding the so-called tyranny of distance, but also the number of operations conducted. It was in the Pacific that the AGC would be most fully deployed. Next slide. The first to see Pacific action was Appalachian and Rocky Mount in the January 1944 assaults on the Marshall Islands atolls. Following quickly on Tarawa, this operation incorporated the hard-learned lessons and effectively integrated the AGC's CIC, radio, and radar features. Proving their value, they directed the operation that Kelly Turner's biographer termed the perfect one. By April 1944, however, Pacific forces afloat demanded facilities for more personnel. The C-2 hull, however, had been squeezed to its limit. Even with increased accommodations, the landing forces wanted space for 185 officers and the 1,000 enlisted, but no deck houses could be added without violating draft and stability limits. New ships offered two alternatives in June 1944: split the ship's functions or adopt a larger hull. Neither was acceptable because the AGC's purpose was to unify command, and as for a larger hull, the AGC was already thought to be too large and easily identifiable, and none were available. The Marines also wanted enough AGCs for all landing force commands down to division level. A multi-division or corps landing might well employ AGCs on two levels, one for overall command and one for each of up to three divisions. An Army level or multi-corps landing as at Okinawa would necessarily add a higher level. Just as in the ETO, operational experience and more command ships increased functional diversification. There were also revised procedures for naval gunfire and close air support with the emergence of the Chascos. After the Marshalls, Appalachian and Rocky Mount reprised their AGC role for the June-July 1944 Marianas invasions. Mount McKinley directed the 1st Marine Division's Peleliu landing in September 1944 to coordinated gunfire support for the 5th Marines landing on nearby Amphibious. For the October 1944 Leyte invasion, Mount Olympus served as flagship and headquarters afloat in her first operational employment. Given the operation's size, she was joined by 5 additional AGCs. At Iwo Jima, February 1945, El Dorado served as Vice Admiral Turner's flagship for the assault and the headquarters for war correspondence. Meanwhile, Estes controlled underwater demolition teams and the pre-assault bombardment, and Biscayne controlled the invasion area's destroyer screen. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945 would be the fullest deployment of AGCs, with 10 serving during the campaign. Concurrent with these landings, the adapted Coast Guard cutters Ingham and Spencer served as command ships for landings in the Philippines and Borneo. With VJ Day, the AGCs supported the occupation of Japan and conducted over other post-war duties. Though never executed, the two-part invasion of Japan was to employ 14 AGCs. Next slide. After the war, the British believed the AGCs were not as well adapted as the LSH because the U.S. Navy built them to be a single design. While HMS Lothian impressed the U.S. Navy when sent to the Pacific in July 1944, the AGCs had superior photography, printing, and display facilities. With the Axis ignorant of their importance, the AGCs were essentially a wartime secret, and none were lost in combat. With the post-war revelation of their worth, however, it would seem likely that they would be targeted in the future. In the end, 9 AGCs were laid up soon after the war and never recommissioned. 2 more were decommissioned in 1955 and 56, while 5 survived into the 1960s. Mount McKinley was one of the ones that performed notably in the Cold War era, landing troops and conducting amphibious operations in the Korean War, and also being the ship that coordinated the landing of the first combat troops in Vietnam in 1965. El Dorado would be the last of the AGCs, decommissioning as LCC-11 on 8 November. The surviving links to the AGCs and their function are the 7th Fleet flagship Blue Ridge and the 6th Fleet flagship Mount Whitney. Next slide. With their successful employment in the increasingly complicated amphibious operations after 1943, the AGCs routinely accomplished what had been deemed impossible after World War I. Through innovative ingenuity and effort, these improvised ships became the essential network-centric hubs for the successful execution of an emergent doctrine by disparate units that not only landed soldiers and Marines on hostile shores, but provided the effective command and control that enabled them to fight.
You know, right in there?
I feel like I got a mouthful of comments. As you've been told, each of these was part of a larger product, and in some cases, I actually got to read some of this beforehand, and we provided comments. And guys was one of those where I already provided extensive notes and things like that. So I saved a few rounds, but just for fun. I fully admit, I mean, having spent the better part of 2 decades working for the Marine Corps, I don't know very much about UDTs, so it's just kind of fun to read this and hear the story. So thank you for always giving me a chance to learn and read more. I just usually come up with a few questions and some suggestions. I mean, you can take them or leave them however you want, but I'm really trying to foster dialogue between us and the audience. In all the papers, we talk about the observations that our military is doing beforehand, particularly with the British, and particularly commandos. And in the case of the British, observing the British with regard to EVP work, were there any comments relative to what we believe the British were doing well, but more importantly, what they weren't doing well, and therefore we didn't want to do by replicating or could improve upon? I mean, we'll go. Hang on to it, then we'll come back to it.
Okay.
I'll go through them. In your paper, and I don't know if I can't remember if you said it or if I read it, but you talk about the CVs and the possible responsibility for UDT role. I was curious to know why they could take on the responsibility, or was it couldn't or didn't want it. Because one would think, CVs are really great at building. I'm pretty sure you can blow things up too and destroy. So that's the question. And again, same thought, but now with the Marine Corps, because 20 years ago, I have to ask, was there discussion about the Marines taking on that role because of their primary role of landing, which is an extension of that?
Right.
But I did like the idea that Kaufman, who couldn't get commissioned because he had poor eyesight, but yet goes on to be bomb disposal, which is scary. We all that. But those are the questions that I've got for you, and I could save them and we can come back to them after I ask the other.
Okay.
It'd make it a little bit easier. Since Nick's not here, I can't really ask his, and then unfortunately Chris has left, so I'm going to probably blow through these. But some of the things that I was thinking about was, yes, they're doing the flexes in the 20s and the 30s, but what about the advanced base problem exercises that were going on as well? Major Jake Hubbard, who was at the War College recently, just his paper was on this under Dave Conan. It is really quite interesting with the extensive amount of stuff. Where do they overlap, and what's the difference between the two? And that's just out there. Anybody wants to jump on it, feel free. As a historian for force structure for so long, I'm always keen on where these things evolve into what we know them, particularly like the first beach signal company, which actually becomes First JASCO. I thought maybe Nick might want to look into it, but since he's down the rabbit hole, that might be a little bit too far to go. And we did talk a little bit in Chris's paper about the Naval Gunfire section, which was created in late '43, that later becomes the Tactical Gunfire Air Observation Training Center in Oahu. And again, it morphs into Air Observers Training Center. And my thought was, question was, creation of the LFASCU units in '45 and JASCOs as the Naval Gunfire responsibility. I wonder if the two schools of thought collaborated to purposely diverge in their force structure and capabilities, or was this a natural progression? Again, he's not here to answer, and Chris has failed on us. I'll nail him later. And then Chris's paper, this is fun. The unsung heroes of any war are those that are deemed unsexy and behind-the-scenes aspects that make direct combat possible, such as the men and women who keep the forces fed, forces equipped, and those who run the show from offshore, let alone the vessels and craft with catchy names like alligator and ducks, such as the case of the AJC. Not as sexy as the battleship, a carrier, or a submarine, but as vital as Chris has clearly demonstrated with his paper. Even within the realm of ships for amphibious landings, the AJC gets little notice against the LSTDA. But 100 years later, after Lejeune deemed the Marine Corps' mission for supporting the Navy has come to pass again, here we are. What is old is new again. And I love that, we're talking about Ellis again, and we're talking about you guys. So as I read over the notes for your presentation, the thoughts I have, again, it goes back to the observation of the British. They had a lot of experience. But as you may or not be aware, there were actually several Marines who were on Mountbatten staff through this period. Franklin Hart being one of them, who actually witnesses the death rate that It has a really great report that you might want to, if you haven't seen it, you want to look at it because the Marine Corps pours over this and just eat this thing alive, and it really, really helps them with early planning. Another one was more on the air side, and that's Harold Denny Campbell, who was in Norwich. Their material might be interesting if you feel like you need another rabbit hole to go down.
Always.
Always, yeah, we're historians, we can't help ourselves. I'm curious to know what the experiences were for the Japanese. Their amphibious operations in the Pacific would be ripe for research, and I'm curious to know how they handled the command and control situation. If they came up with an alternate method than something like the HEC. Of course, as I've said, there's never enough time for all the papers and conferences, and especially when they're a larger body of work. So you may have covered this in your larger piece, but thinking about the general board, and then active role that they played in amphibious warfare and ship construction, such as carriage and battleships, did they have a more of a role than you described in your paper, or not? Just curious. Yeah. Again, I like to leave lots of time for questions for them to answer, and then for questions from the audience. So forgive me for rattling too quickly, but apparently I've had caffeine at lunch and I'm really feeling it. I will let you guys chomp on the questions and then let the audience chime in. I'm going to go back.
Well, I mean, speaking about the British, there's so many aspects to trying to study and research this and everything. So I didn't really get into the British side of it and what they were looking at and what they didn't like, and those kinds of things. So can't really speak to that. As far as the CBs, of course, yeah, they're supposed to be building stuff, not really supposed to be destroying anything. I don't know if there was rivalry or some kind of, but Admiral King said, get it done.
Yeah.
And he wanted that special unit. And the CBs fought as well.
Right.
But, there was a lot of competition at the time between, the pre-war especially, and the Army was really taking the lead in demolition, like that. And there was some arguments about, well, okay, who's going to take care of the beach? And the Army said, well, we'll take care of that. Well, then the Navy said, well, who's going to take care of the obstacles under the water? Oh, we got you there. So that's how that kind of evolved from that. Yeah.
And then it was about the Marine Corps. I was just curious if.
Again, another one of those aspects I didn't really get into too much, but
I could see them trying to
larger
weigh
work.
in.
Yeah, definitely.
But then again, they were like, we got another goal.
Yeah.
It's not that we got another goal. We got the Raiders.
Yeah. They were. I mean, each branch was trying to create,
Right.
their own special unit at the time during warfare. Most of that.
In regard to your question concerning the general board, because that was the last one I remember that. I can't say that I looked at that specifically, but given the manner in which they proceeded and doing the ad hoc acquisitions, burning the ships as they did, taking available hulls, I would say that it was the farthest thing from their mind. That the Navy, as has often been said in a lot of other forums and in a lot of the literature, the leadership of the Navy was not really all that interested in amphibious warfare. You had the individuals who were, the leaders not so much, and that the amphibious supported the Marine Corps. And again, being a former Coast Guard historian, I actually was looking at the time was that the Navy was so uninterested in supporting and developing amphibious warfare doctrine in the 1930s that the Marine Corps went to the Coast Guard and said, hey, can you give us ships so we can conduct training operations? And I never got too far down the rabbit hole on that one, but it just seems that it really was, if it was discussed, nothing was really acted upon. So in regard to that particular question, what was the other one again?
The Japanese.
Oh,
I'm curious about their experience with this situation.
I know the Japanese developed a special amphibious warfare ship, which I've seen photographs of, and Kulak, I think had, when he was sending his intelligence reports back from the Sino-Japanese War in 1970 operations around Shanghai, has a photograph of this particular ship. I don't know that it served in the same capacity. It was, I believe, I forget the ship's name. I believe it served as some sort of command and control capacity, but had nowhere near the technology that was subsequently mounted on both the British. And the scale of the Japanese operations in 1941, early 1942, didn't incorporate air assets in the same manner and combined operations that the Americans subsequently do, both in Europe and the Pacific. So,
I'm gonna chime in a little bit on some of the general board stuff and also just the whole approach to amphibious warfare, because I spent a lot of time sitting in minutes reading general board microfilm a long time ago. But the thing is, you're looking at a period in the 30s where you've got very limited resources and what are going to be your priorities. So I don't think they're worrying about, okay, Marines may come in here and tell us a little bit about amphibious stuff, but they're not worrying about it very much. And the fact that, even in the beginning of the conflict, you've got to do naval gunfire support. Oh, that's like your third or fourth duty, Lieutenant J.G. Jones. You worry about that somewhere down the road. One of the things I thought about with Guy's paper and looking at what's going on in the different theaters is, we kind of find out what's going on with UDPs in the South Pacific and the Central Pacific. But if I recall correctly, for operations in the 7th Fleet, MacArthur's Navy, they actually had a specialized engineering force within the Army structure out there that I think overlapped, if not, in fact, did some of the same mission. I think that may be something to look at that, they sort of always exist out there as a, side different thing. Clearly, they're using some of the AGCs in those operations, particularly in Indonesia. And, and of course, as Chris pointed out, when we're talking about, MacArthur, yeah, he's riding Mount McKinley at Incheon. And you talk about pressing, you got the amphibious force commander, Doyle's on the ship. He's got the corps commander, Ned Almond, on the ship. Oh, by the way, here comes MacArthur, and he brings the whole, joint command, to the vessel. They were more than a little pressed, but the one thing that shocked, MacArthur's staff, since, okay, you don't really have an operational role in this thing. When they got presented a mess bill when they were getting ready to leave the ship, it's like, you're just here as a guest. But with that, I'll open it up to questions here. We're going to start with John Midoff.
I enjoyed how all the presentations complemented each other. Real quick, for Chris Habern, just a question about jamming. Did the Navy have any concern about the enemy jamming radio signals, and did the Germans or Japanese actually suspect that we had these AGC types, doing a lot of the C2 with the radio? And then one quick counterfactual, we didn't lose any, fortunately, but especially early on in early 44, had we lost one, just to say a sub got lucky and took one out, was there enough redundancy built in to handle it? I know it's just counterfactual, but those are the 2 questions.
to answer your first question, I can't really speak to what the Japanese, what Japanese and German potential countermeasures were. I wasn't able to get into that. That is something that I should perhaps look at. When I finish the much larger project, that will be something to consider. As far as the redundancy of the ship, as I mentioned in the paper, first operation had 2 both Appalachian and Rocky Mount were involved in that operation. Had one of them been lost, I imagine there would have been a redistribution of responsibility and cross-loading or whatever to ensure that their continuation of the mission. Also, there were other ships that were developed that were part of the LCCs, which subsequently becomes the designator for that ship, the larger ships. Like, as I mentioned, El Dorado was decommissioned, was LCC. LCC emerged as, it was the ship that Nick alluded to but didn't give the designation. Those were the ships that were placed on the flank to make sure that they were landing control craft, is what the LCC was. So they were the ships that basically ran out on the edges and made sure everybody stayed online going into the beach. They were the ones that called in the progress reports as an Army guy, phase lines and things of that sort would be basically determination of the milestones on the approach to the beaches and made sure everybody stayed in line going in as best as could be controlled, that you can make the landings in the appropriate manner. So there would have been, I would imagine, a distribution of that function amongst those ships as well.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, I have a question for Guy, and you mentioned Draper Kaufman. He's just such a neat guy. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about him as a grader. Let me tell you why I'm coming from with Draper Kaufman, because in '63, I just discovered this about him. In 1963, he's running an office secretariat called the Office of Program Appraisal, and he's put in there, and he's really pissed because he doesn't think the office should be in the secretariat because it's going to help McNamara. So he starts to work with other officers in OPNet, trying to get them to set up their own programming office, which they ultimately do. And when I go and read his oral history, I'm reading about this. He's just such a neat guy. He's an organizer and able to work with others very well and work across organizational lines and people above and below him. And so I'm wondering if you could talk more about Draper Kaufman and his organizational skills and what you found out about him.
The first thing I noticed about him right away was just that he seems like a born leader. And his father was an admiral. The type of guy, and I mentioned it in my talk, is that he led from the front. He went through Hell Week, which he devised himself, just to prove to everybody else, that may have said, "Oh, look at this old guy. He's not going to be able to do it." He was a smoker at the time, and he said it almost killed him to do that, but he was willing to do that because that's the kind of leader he knew he had to be, the type that leads from the front. So if something needed to get done, if they needed to get some supplies or whatever it was, he was the type of guy, much like the Seabees, that could build from the ground up, And of course, he went into bomb disposal after he was captured in France by the Germans, and he goes to Britain and gets into disposal, and he actually brings that knowledge back to the States. So he knows a little bit of everything. He had been a midshipman, so he knew that, and his father being the admiral. He's just taking all these bits of info, and then he's using that in whatever job he does, and he was superintendent here, the Naval Academy as well. So he's just a phenomenal organizer, and he knows the type of people he needs to surround himself with to get a job done. That's it for him. It's just paramount. Do it.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, sir.
This question is for Mr. Habern. Do you know if the submarine fleet in the Pacific was incorporated under the AGCs, like if they had any role in helping out with the amphibious landings?
I haven't come across anything that indicates that. Given the levels of control that were required for the successful conduct of an amphibious operation, to perhaps bring that on function. I've not seen any references to control of submarines in support of an amphibious operation. Screen, perhaps there would have been a submarine screen at greater distance, that invasion force against surface or subsurface attack by the Japanese at some greater length. But the actual control of those, I think, would have been perhaps on, I'm not sure, I'm just guessing here, like on other flagship, that would be a flagship function, or some subordinate command would have the command and control of those assets. I don't believe that, I've not come across anything that would indicate that an AGC would be exercising any operational control, especially given its proximity, the proximity of those ships to landing beaches, because they actually had to be in close. And as I said, as I alluded to in the paper, where the demands of putting people on board the ship were so extreme that they wanted to make them bigger. And, you know, they're like, and again, the fact that nothing was sunk, as we discussed earlier, is frankly quite impressive, or it was a great oversight on the part of the Axis, because anybody with eyes could see that these things have lots of antenna coming off of them, and they got all kinds of things. So they must be performing some sort of vital function, because why would they have this stuff? Now, maybe that's just the perspective of us looking back, and in the electronic age in which we live, so we become conscious of those types of things on board ships. But, you know, as I said, they basically hid in plain sight, and yet performed an exceedingly vital function in controlling all different aspects of, and it was not just it was not just electronically intensive, but it was manpower intensive. And just, I mean, as I was doing this, I'm like, that's why in the earlier edition, which Curtis and that have seen, is like, I talk about the performance of mundane but critical clerical functions. Like, you really think about the fact that, going back to the British operation of Dakar, they had one typewriter in the Army, okay, to issue some 500 orders, okay? That's why we don't think of the fact that Army operations or military operations are contingent upon having typewriters, or just simple clerical things just for the distribution of information. Yes, nowadays you can deploy a unit and zip them all kinds of information, you know, intelligence reports, all kinds of stuff. But in the 1940s, this was the means by which they did those things.
Yes, sir. More of a comment to, you had a question about the Japanese AGCs.
Right.
They tried, but because our submarines sunk everything, they never had it. I think they lost 4 with like 7 divisions on these ships, and they went down like before they got to the island. That's why they started using fast destroyers and DEs to bring them in. They would actually gut the center of the ship, fill them with men and as much food and other supplies that they can get, zip them in, and zip out as quickly as they can, because their submarines thought it not kosher, for lack of a better term at this point, to sink a non-combatant, what they considered a non-combatant. We didn't care. We sunk anything that floated. So they did try it. It didn't work. They were too slow. They only went 11 knots. So they switched over to gutting destroyers and DEs and using those, because they were a lot faster and they had more of a chance of getting their people.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, the world.
No, sir.
No questions from the outside
No
world?
questions from
I'm gonna throw one question out, because this is a question I asked Chris when I was reading his paper. You know, because he talks extensively, far more than he presented here, about how much equipment they're jamming into these things. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, my God, what's the electrical load required? You know, are these things built with this? Now, I know we got a couple of, you know, former SWOs in the room, Anybody ever serve on Mount Whitney or Blue Ridge?
I did a TAD. I did a TAD on the Blue Ridge.
Okay, all right, so yeah,
Their generators were huge.
oh,
They
yeah.
were bigger than the engines that pushed the ship.
Well, the thing is that they're all fed off the same
Off the
relatively
same- yeah, the
small
same
oil
group, yeah.
plant. And, back, when I was early on with the old NHC in 1993, I was actually put out for an exercise on Mount Whitney when she was still Second Fleet Flag. Dr. Jeff Barlow and I went out and we were like, hey, we want to see everything. We don't get out to sea very much. And just the number of auxiliary
Yeah.
generators they had.
Every empty space had a generator.
And we're cruising along one day, gonna do our close-in weapon shoot in the afternoon. I'm walking back to the wardroom to get lunch, and all of a sudden there's just this weird humming lurch sound because somebody had forgotten to reprime something after we did an unrep that morning, and the boilers just dropped. One deck below the hatch that I was going past was one of these emergency diesel generators, and it just kicked in immediately because the electrical, there's diesel smoke and oil and stuff going all through the hull of the ship, because there was another one on the other side of the ship. And I'm just like, my God, I think that's one of those things that people just don't really think about with these things is the electrical load requirement. And now in a more digital age, and with, and well, this was true even with 40 years ago. How do you keep the space cold enough so your machine still runs? Particularly if you've got to operate in the tropics, in the Middle East, somewhere where it's really hot. Computers don't like heat. And so there's something else you got to throw on the electrical load is keeping your HVAC plant working. And it just, and you'll notice when Chris talks about, oh, yeah, they're going to do HVAC. Yeah, they ain't worried about, the officers or the sailor being comfortable. Oh, we got to keep CIC functioning.
Yeah. One of the things I had to cut for time was a brief discussion or mention the fact that while those particular spaces, the CICs and the photo interpretation rooms were ordered in November 44, ordered to be air conditioned, there was another comment in there that basically says that the crews worked to do likewise to other spaces, and that proved to be largely unsuccessful. So, that's just how it goes, priorities being what they are.
Mark?
Yeah, this just raised a question for me, not the generator comment, but but just the whole idea of a ship and it changing over time, Chris, when you're talking about electronics and computers. I'm wondering, Chris, how far you've looked into this ship, how far forward you've gone out of World War II, and seeing change over time with the ship itself. Is there change in how they use it in Korea? Have you looked at it there? In terms of the command and control function of the ship, the inside of the ship, anything like that?
I haven't gotten to that level of granularity because I was really focused on the World War II mission, the improvisation of these ships to meet this mission. And given the fact that so many of them, like as I mentioned, 9 of them were decom, essentially, or laid up and then scrapped right after the war. There were technically 18 AGCs. The Coast Guard cutters, the 6 of them reverted back to the Coast Guard and went back to being doing their Coast Guard stuff. They're designated WPG from their designation as WAGs, the AGCs. So of the Navy ones, there were.
Lessons learned that they apply to new ships?
Well, there was the new class, but the LCCs weren't built until the 60s, the late 60s. Yeah, so there wasn't a need for these ships in the Cold War period.
Right.
I had to cut some discussion. Mount McKinley, thank you. It was in the 7th Fleet, it just so happened to be out there. It was on a Westpac deployment. And they were able to bring American troops and land them in Korea the start of the war. They were in close proximity, and Wynn picked them up and landed them at Pohang. Then, of course, there was a command ship for Incheon. It later was the Wonsan, and was also in command of the evacuation at Hungnam after Chosin Reservoir. And then after that, it had to go back to the States for maintenance. El Dorado was there, was at Incheon, and then supported the drive of the UN forces on the western side into North Korea, and then and basically continued in service. Not as prominently. The Mount McKinley was also involved. It was the Amphibious flagship for the Atlantic Fleet during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then was subsequently again transferred to the Pacific. It was a 7th Fleet Amphibious Force command ship, and like as I mentioned briefly, that it was the ship that coordinated the landing of the Marines at Da Nang in March and April of 1965. So it was still doing that, and then it was subsequently decommed, and El Dorado was the last one in 72. And by that time, the designator for the ship class had changed to LCC. So they merged the smaller LCCs with designation of the larger AGCs, and then obviously they built Blue Ridge and Mount Whitney, and there were 2 remaining ships that primarily performed that function.
And think about this, those are 2 hulls commissioned in the late 60s. And, and they're still functioning, and there's, I mean.
They just refurbished the electronics in it.
Right.
Yeah.
But these are, are they the last 2 live steamships we have?
I think so.
Yeah, and, where the.
They don't have turbines running them either.
I think
They're-
they actually, one of them actually is the oldest commission.
Right, and because believe you me, if, when I was out for this exercise, and I was also on the Guadalcanal briefly, which is essentially the same hull, the old big deck amphib, it's wonderful in July when you're in the Gulf Stream and you're in a boiler room on one of those ships. That's warm.
110 to 120 degrees.
Oh, yeah. I liked how the engineering officer explained to us, there's the poor guy that's got to stand at the boiler face, the hunk of glass and look in. And there's like this 18-inch duct just dropping AC on him. And there's a human stress indicator hanging from the bottom of the duct. Most of us call this a thermometer. And even with all this stuff, even with all this AC drop, it's still reading like 98 degrees. All right, any other questions? All right, I'd like to thank the panel. Appreciate all your work, and thank you all for attending. And you can get over to the museum. For those who are It's military.
Great panel, guys.
But
Appreciate bringing up the ducks. I so desperately wanted to do that. I was some sort of thing like material fauna.
Very few of us, most of us are here.
Thank you, boss.
Yeah, he's doing virtual.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm over this.
Yes,
It's like.
Well, I'm sure we're well advised. What in the leg?
Late 90s.
Okay. I had, one of my roommates in college.
And second class, I was
And we had a mutual friend.
after I destroyed two of them in like 6 months. I'm like, what's this? They said, this is you.
Yeah.
He's like, quit drinking this Your baby's done.
Yeah.